In 60 AD, a woman mounted on a chariot shattered the silence of the empire. Her voice, once stifled by forced alliances and Roman punishments, rose like thunder over Britannia. Her name was Boudica, and her revolt was not just a tribal uprising, it was the manifestation of collective trauma, the awakening of a nation that had been conquered but never subdued. Rome, in extending its borders to the northwestern reaches of the British Isles, believed it had completed another successful campaign. Roads were built, fortresses erected, taxes collected. But beneath the veneer of order and progress, something invisible was simmering. A moral wound inflicted by public humiliation, the violation of tribal honor, and the dissolution of ancient autonomies refused to heal with infrastructure. It festered in silence, and Rome's mistake was not tactical, it was psychological. Boudica was not a professional strategist. She hadn't studied siege tactics or the doctrines of the legions. But she knew pain, and that pain turned into fury. After being flogged in front of her people and watching her daughters violated, the queen of the Iceni understood what Roman generals never grasped, that honor, when crushed, can become a people's most destructive force. Military historian Victor Davis Hanson reminds us that the true battlefield is often not the terrain, it's perception. Rome ignored this principle. It treated Britannia's tribes like chess pieces, when in reality it had ignited a collective pride that lay dormant beneath the surface. Boudica'S revolt was more than an insurrection. It was a psychological war, a visceral response to the contempt of an empire that believed swords and aqueducts were enough to enforce loyalty. The legions stationed in Britannia were experienced, disciplined, and confident in their logistical superiority, but they were poorly positioned, fragmented, and tethered to a slow, arrogant chain of command. Rome's response to the uprising was delayed. When it finally arrived, it found cities in ruins, settlers slaughtered, and an empire in shock. The attack on Camulodunum was not just military, it was symbolic. Temples, Roman homes, and symbols of civilization were reduced to ashes, a declaration of war against the very idea of foreign domination. In this documentary, you'll be taken behind the scenes of this brutal revolt, to the strategic errors, the command decisions, and the anatomy of a war where every choice shaped an empire's fate. We'll see how the absence of genuine reconciliation, cultural neglect, and disdain for tribal values pushed Rome to the brink, and how one woman, armed not with legions, but with fury and memory, nearly turned history upside down. Prepare to dive into a conflict where the lines between victory and defeat are blurred, where the battlefield is also the heart of a people, where the greatest strategic error was not made with a sword, but with disdain. This is not just Boudica'S story. It's the story of every empire that dared to scorn the vanquished and paid the price. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Boudica'S revolt, give it a thumbs up to show your support and subscribe to the channel to catch the next chapters. Share in the comments what stood out most to you so far: Boudica'S courage, Rome's failures, or the psychological impact of this revolt. Your feedback makes all the difference in helping us keep producing high-quality content. Even before a single blow was struck, Rome had already lost something crucial in Britannia: consent. The swift and ruthless military conquest was not followed by lasting social engineering. Instead of reconciliation, Rome offered taxes. Instead of respect, it demanded submission. What seemed like pacification was merely a tactical silence, a pause in the rage that would soon erupt with devastating force. The legions built fortresses, constructed roads, imposed their language and laws, but they left untouched the open wounds of resistance. The tribal peoples, brave, proud, rooted in ancestral traditions, were forced to witness the symbolic demolition of their leadership and the ridicule of their customs. For Rome, victory was arithmetic, the number of fortresses, active mines, quartered legions. For the vanquished, it was the amputation of their identity. Historically, the absence of genuine reconciliation after military victories has proven fatal. In Vietnam, the United States won nearly every tactical battle, yet lost the war. In Afghanistan, Western coalitions took cities but never won hearts. Britannia in the 1st century foreshadowed these lessons. Rome ignored the signs of accumulated resentment and relied too heavily on military superiority. It was a false confidence. The Romans failed to decode the invisible enemy, the memory of humiliation. Tribal culture measured power not by legions or aqueducts, but by honor. And when that honor was dragged through the streets, with leaders turned into vassals and queens flogged before crowds, war became inevitable. Not for territory, but for dignity. The error lay not with the generals, but in the imperial mindset. By imposing oppressive infrastructure before building political bridges, Rome sowed the seeds of its own crisis. Every road built without dialogue was seen as a path of invasion. Every fortress, a monument to occupation. Every tax, extortion in disguise. Documents and chronicles from the time show little concern for the local spirit. Roman writers extolled progress, but ignored the psychological impact of domination. Archaeological maps reveal rapid urban expansion in conquered areas, but also signs of tension. Abandoned structures, villages rebuilt after fires, makeshift cemeteries in supposedly pacified regions. Boudica'S war didn't come out of nowhere. It was the logical consequence of a foreign presence that spurned reconciliation. By treating Britannia as a province rather than a society, Rome didn't just underestimate its enemy, it created it. In that invisible error, it sealed the fate of thousands. This is the imperial paradox: to conquer without convincing, to impose without integrating, to dominate without dialogue. And when the spark of revolt ignited, it was too late. The empire had mistaken silence for loyalty and would pay a terrible price for it. She wasn't born for war, but war chose her. Boudica, queen of the Iceni, was shaped not by political ambition, but by violence. The public flogging before her people, the brutal violation of her daughters, the formal dissolution of tribal autonomy, each act was a blow to the collective soul of the Britons. And at the heart of this abyss, a figure emerged who led not just by dynastic right, but by a shared open wound. It wasn't uncommon in Celtic tradition for women to take prominent roles, but Boudica transcended that custom. She became a symbol, a living response to Roman disrespect. Her red hair and towering presence weren't just physical descriptions, they became mental images of defiance. She was the embodiment of what Rome had ignored: memory, rage, tribal pride. Trauma was her baptism by fire. The emergent leadership she wielded wasn't built in councils or formal pacts. It arose from shared pain. With every village burned by the Romans, every tax extracted by force, every public humiliation, another ally was born. Her voice didn't just say, "Resist," it screamed, "Avenge." And the instinct for vengeance, far from mere impulse, became a tactic of unity. This kind of leadership, born from deep emotion, is hard to predict and nearly impossible to contain. It's not a regular army following orders. It's a morally mobilized mass, convinced that fighting is the only possible response. The revolt wasn't just organized, it was staged with the fury of those who had already lost everything. And that made it lethal. Roman sources, like Tacitus and Dio Cassius, portray Boudica with reluctant respect. She was called a barbarian, but described as charismatic, fierce, almost supernatural. not because she was a technical strategist, but because she mastered the most volatile battlefield, the emotional one. She understood what Clausewitz would later define as the trinity of war: the people, the government, and the army. In Britannia, all three were united in her cry. Excavations in Norfolk and Suffolk reveal areas of destruction that align with accounts of the revolt. Evidence of coordinated fires, skeletons in execution poses, and the abrupt halt of Roman activities suggest an offensive that went beyond mere resistance. It was a campaign of moral vengeance, and at its center was a woman who turned pain into command. Unlike commanders trained in academies, Boudica led because there was nothing left between her people and the abyss. She was the last bastion of tribal honor. Her leadership emerged from absolute necessity, and that purity of purpose made her unstoppable for a time. There was no salary, no barracks, only the certainty that as long as Boudica rode at the front, humiliation would not be forgotten. And Rome, for the first time in centuries, feared the roar of a people led by a queen who didn't demand justice, she demanded redemption. Rome relied on the weight of numbers, discipline, and technique. But beneath the perfect columns of its legions lay a hidden flaw: the illusion that military presence equaled true control. Britannia, geographically distant and culturally resistant, exposed this structural vulnerability. The strength was there, but the foundation of legitimacy was missing. The legions stationed in the north operated in isolated garrisons, with stretched supply lines and vulnerable communication. The soldiers, though well-trained, were poorly distributed and psychologically unprepared for a widespread insurgency. Their marching order was designed for invasions, not for defending against internal uprisings. Boudica'S revolt showed how this strategic orientation became a liability when the fire erupted within their own borders. Liddell Hart's theory, strength without adaptation is pure vulnerability, applies perfectly to the Roman situation. The military machine worked efficiently in conventional battles, but struggled against tribal guerrilla tactics, rapid attacks, sabotage, and the destruction of symbolic infrastructure. It was like trying to hold back a raging sea with misplaced walls. Archaeological evidence points to this structural disadvantage. In Camulodunum, where the revolt began with brutality, there are clear signs of minimal resistance. Excavations show the city, a symbol of Roman occupation, lacked an adequate military detachment. Its temple to Claudius, grand in architecture, proved useless as a stronghold. It was a target, not a fortress. Roman logistics, though robust, relied on predictable routes and territorial security. But when every road became a potential ambush and every allied village fell silent, supplies turned into liabilities. Columns of provisions became moving traps, and officers, uninformed, were forced to react slowly in a theater of operations that demanded absolute agility. Moreover, blind confidence in technical superiority bred a dangerous complacency. The belief that fragmented tribes could never coordinate an offensive led to underestimated strategic decisions. The Romans saw the Britons as inferior, militarily and civilizationally, but they ignored the power of an enemy fighting on its own land, with rage in its heart and terrain on its side. This kind of error recurs in military history. Technically superior armies are often defeated by adversaries with fewer resources but greater purpose. The fallacy of strength lies in assuming absolute power resides solely in arsenals. True strength lies in adaptability, understanding the human and physical terrain, and the willingness to read the invisible. In Britannia, Rome failed to see what truly mattered. The legions were there, but control had already slipped through the cracks of disdain, the arrogance of occupation, and the illusion that a people without walls could never topple an empire. It was this misperception, not a lack of power, that brought Rome to the edge of collapse in its most remote province, and it showed the world that marching to conquer is not enough. You must stay to govern. The Britons' revolt didn't follow a calculated plan. There were no detailed maps or strategies drawn from military manuals. But there was a clear goal: to destroy not just the physical structures of Roman occupation, but the symbols that upheld its authority. Every city burned, every monument defiled, every Roman citizen executed. It was all part of a war of meaning. Fury became a method. The attack on Camulodunum was the first sign of this logic. The city, built on indigenous land, boasted an imposing temple to Emperor Claudius, a building that didn't represent faith, but domination. Its sacking wasn't random. It was a surgical strike on the symbolic level, erasing the conqueror's face from the island's landscape. The Britons knew they couldn't defeat Rome with weapons, but they could weaken it emotionally, exposing its fragility before a people no longer afraid to die. Londinium followed the same pattern. Though economically strategic, the city was abandoned by Suetonius Paulinus. Its abandonment revealed more than a tactical decision. It showed the Roman command's recognition that the Britons weren't acting like disorganized barbarians. They were waging a campaign of symbolic terror, capable of destabilizing the empire's sense of invincibility. Verulacium finally was consumed by flames in an offensive that combined execution, destruction, and theatrics. Reports suggest the rebels used traditional rituals, like impaling statues and defiling Roman writings, to emphasize that this wasn't mere retaliation, it was cultural purging. The war now operated on two levels: physical and psychological. This strategy finds parallels in modern conflict. In African colonial wars, rebels often targeted symbols of European presence, churches, train stations, administrative buildings, not for their military utility, but for their propaganda value. Similarly, Boudica'S attacks weren't driven solely by anger, but an intuitive understanding of the psychological impact of destruction. The panic among settlers, the collapse of trade routes, the administrative paralysis, all were achieved without pitched battles. Excavations in the ruins of Camulodunum and Londinium reveal patterns of systematic devastation. Thick layers of ash, uniform burn marks, and skeletons buried without rites point to swift, violent deaths. The absence of formal burials in many areas suggests a deliberate intent to break with Roman civilizational protocols. It was the rejection of Roman ritual replaced by chaos as a language of resistance. At this point in the campaign, the Britons had realized that war was also fought in the mind. The terror they spread was as effective as any armed legion. Fleeing citizens, disrupted messages, paralyzed governors. It wasn't necessary to besiege Rome to shake the empire. It was enough to make it unrecognizable within its own borders. Fury, channeled with precision, became a high-impact strategic tool. By wielding symbolic destruction as a weapon, Boudica didn't just avenge her pain. For a brief moment, she reshaped the psychological balance of power in Britannia. An empire that believed itself eternal trembled before the invisible force of a woman who understood, better than many generals, that symbols fall before armies do. And when they fall, they drag the illusion of invulnerability with them. War, no matter how planned, is also defined by the response to the unexpected, and in this, Rome faltered. When Boudica'S revolt spread like wildfire through Roman colonies in Britannia, General Gaius Suetonius Paulinus was not where he needed to be. He was far off in the west, leading campaigns in the Welsh mountains, trying to eradicate the Druids on the sacred island of Mona. His absence in the east, where the attacks began, created a command vacuum that the insurgents exploited with brutal efficiency. The slow response wasn't just a matter of speed, it was a failure of strategic perception. The empire didn't see the Britons as a coordinated threat. It viewed them as scattered populations, incapable of broad articulation. So, when the first signs of revolt arrived, fires, attacks on settlers, cities ablaze, messengers faced long distances and delays in decision-making. Local officers hesitated, waiting for orders that never came in time. Meanwhile, cities fell one by one. Letters exchanged between governors and legates revealed the rigidity of Rome's bureaucratic system. Instead of adaptability, there was protocol. Instead of tactical autonomy, they awaited central command. In an asymmetric scenario, this became a trap. And here, Britannia's story intersects with later examples. In the Siege of Bastogne in 1944, poor communication nearly collapsed Allied forces until small units' autonomy made the difference. In Britannia, that flexibility didn't exist. Rome's structure was powerful, but inflexible. And in irregular warfare, flexibility is survival. Logistical dispersion worsened the situation. With supply stockpiles centralized in vulnerable areas and most routes under threat, the legions weren't just distant, they were isolated. Mobilizing troops in time without risking supply lines was impossible. The revolt didn't just paralyze security, it paralyzed mobility. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. In places like Lindinium and Verulamium, signs of disorganized flight and abandoned personal belongings suggest hasty, unplanned evacuations. The lack of defenses at key points indicates decisions came too late. The enemy was already inside the gates when Rome finally understood what it faced. Suetonius Paulinus, upon receiving reports of the revolt, quickly grasped the threat's magnitude. But he also knew he couldn't simply march out and face the mob in open combat. His challenge was multifaceted: reorganize scattered troops, reassess strategy, and find terrain that neutralized the rebels' numerical advantage. Until that moment, Rome was in tactical and moral retreat, and for a brief instant, Britannia's fate seemed to tip toward the insurgents. History records many cases where delay kills more than the sword. In Britannia, the slowness of Roman command didn't just allow initial devastation, it nearly compromised the entire campaign. Boudica had achieved something rare: time. And while the Romans deliberated, she set the map ablaze. An empire can be strong, but when its reaction comes too late, even its strength becomes irrelevant. In the fields and cities of eastern Britannia, Rome nearly tasted defeat, not from inferiority, but from inertia. With cities in ruins and settlers slaughtered, the scene was one of collapse. But amid the chaos, Suetonius Paulinus prepared his response. Isolated in the west, he understood that reacting wasn't enough. He needed to anticipate. Contrary to expectations, he didn't march directly to meet the insurgent horde. He chose the terrain. And with that, he shifted the war's balance. Rome's salvation in Britannia didn't come from the number of soldiers, but from the strategic mind of a general who understood the power of space. Paulinus chose a narrow gorge surrounded by forest, a natural corridor where flanks were protected, and the enemy's sheer numbers became a burden. The concept was what Clausewitz would later call the center of gravity. Identify the enemy's point of greatest pressure and turn it into a weakness. Boudica relied on quantity. Paulinus bet on terrain. It was classic warfare against popular warfare. And in that tight space, tribal chaos would face Roman geometry. In preparing his defensive position, the general had about 10,000 men. The rebels, according to Tacitus, could have numbered over 100,000, a likely exaggerated figure but indicative of the disparity. Yet Paulinus knew Boudica'S advantage was relative. Troops without discipline, without unified command, and dragging families and supply wagons behind the front line were slow, noisy, and vulnerable to maneuvers. Archaeological evidence offers clues about this choice. Sites excavated north of modern Watling Street show soil and terrain consistent with the battle's description. The narrow topography, combined with limited escape routes, was decisive. Paulinus didn't just set up a defensive line, he built a moral trap. Boudica thought she was marching to crush a fleeing army. Instead, she found an invisible wall, built with calculation and cool-headedness. The absence of a rebel ambush also reveals a critical factor. Boudica lacked effective reconnaissance. Moving with the confidence of prior victories, she overlooked tactical variables. The rebels didn't know what awaited them. They expected a legion on the run, not a fortified position, and that misreading of the battlefield would prove costly. Paulinus's decision was more than defensive. It was psychological. It showed Rome could still choose when and where to fight. Instead of being swept away by the revolt's tide, he channeled it. And in doing so, he turned an imminent defeat into a real chance for survival. This moment marked a turning point in the campaign. For the first time since the revolt began, Rome seized the initiative, not through brute force, but through strategic intelligence. The ambush never came, because the Roman general refused to play the prey. He set the stage where his legion could rewrite the narrative. There, in silence, amid dense trees and hardened ground, the slow reversal of a seemingly inevitable disaster began. The war wasn't yet won, but for the first time, it was no longer lost. The Britons' strength lay in their numbers. But in that narrow valley where Suetonius Paulinus waited, those numbers became a weakness. The tribal enthusiasm, fueled by weeks of victories and devastation, collided with the reality of disciplined warfare. The battlefield wasn't a symbolic plain where fury decided the outcome. It was a funnel where order trumped quantity. And the thousands of fighters led by Boudica, without cohesive formation and trapped by their own volume, learned that a poorly directed crowd becomes lethal disorder. The tribes advanced with confidence. They had the psychological edge but ignored basic principles of coordination. Without a clear chain of command, organized reserves, or flanking strategy, they attacked head-on, packed together, constrained by their own numbers. Wagons, women, children, and animals followed the army, clogging the rear and preventing retreat. There was no contingency plan, only momentum. Archaeology paints this picture. Remains of rudimentary weapons, a lack of standardized shields, and bones piled in narrow zones suggest a tactical collapse rather than a frontal massacre. The tribes surged like a tide, but without direction. And when the front line broke, there was no way to regroup. What should have been a siege became a self-inflicted trap. On the other side, the Romans were ready. Compact formation, overlapping shields, synchronized volleys of pila. Discipline stood like a wall. Each uncoordinated rebel attack was absorbed and countered with lethal precision. The legion didn't need grand movements. It simply waited for exhaustion to set in. And when the tribes tired, the Romans advanced. The failure wasn't in courage. The Britons fought with ferocity. But war doesn't reward bravery alone. It rewards coherence. Boudica, despite her charisma, lacked a general staff. Her orders didn't travel clearly along the front line. Communication relied on shouts, improvised signals, and faith in tribal unity. Against a structured enemy, that faith crumbled. Tribes from different regions, speaking varied dialects, couldn't respond cohesively. The emotion that united them wasn't enough to save them in the moment of collapse. The battlefield, by day's end, was a tragic testament to disorganization. Overturned wagons, piled bodies, signs of a suffocated retreat. Rome won not just through technique, but because it understood a fundamental rule of war. Discipline is the antidote to chaos. And in that valley, the chaos was Britain. This lesson echoes through the centuries. Popular armies, no matter how motivated, need structure. Without it, they become easy prey for enemies who operate with surgical precision. In Britannia, overconfidence, disregard for organized military formation, and the illusion of invincibility led thousands to ruin. The crowd, a symbol of fury, turned into tragedy. And in the silence that followed, Rome breathed. It was bloodied but alive, because on the other side, the cry became disorder, and disorder, death. The field was narrow, hemmed by forests that blocked the flanks. Ahead, a tribal mass surged in waves. Behind, a line of Roman shields stood unmoving, a wall of flesh and iron. This was where Britannia's fate would be decided, not in grand maneuvers, but in the rigor of form. The geometry of the legion faced the undisciplined torrent of the revolt, and in the rhythm of the maneuver, Rome rediscovered its supremacy. Suetonius Paulinus adopted a wedge formation, a triangle inverted with the point thrust forward, compressing the enemy and pushing it toward disarray. Up front, pila were launched in unison, delivering a devastating first blow. The Britons, without standardized shields, absorbed the strike like bare walls in a storm of spears. Those who survived crashed against the shield wall, where gladii struck with calculated precision. The coordination was absolute. Every soldier knew their place. Every centurion kept the line tight. There was no improvisation, only method, and that deadly predictability made the legion invincible in this kind of clash. Orders passed in short murmurs. Shields adjusted in sync. Strikes were quick, rhythmic, without wasted effort. Meanwhile, the rebels pushed, shouted, and stumbled over their own dead. The numerical pressure, without room to maneuver, turned into panic. Archaeological studies of sites possibly linked to the battle reveal a concentrated combat pattern. Piled bones in concentric arcs, blade marks on ribs, blunt impact fractures, all point to a massacre in a confined space. The legion didn't pursue, it absorbed and crushed. It was a methodical, almost ritual execution of Roman tactical power in its purest form. The carefully chosen terrain played its role as a silent weapon. The lack of mobility doomed the Britons. Unable to flank or retreat, they became prisoners of their own momentum. Enthusiasm turned into a bottleneck, bravery into suffocation. What began as a triumphant march ended in collective ruin. The legion's discipline was more than technical. It was doctrine. It was a culture of war. Formations, distances, attack angles, everything was taught, rehearsed, memorized. It was the science of war at its sharpest. And there, in wild Britannia, it proved stronger than fury, numbers, or desperation. By battle's end, the field was silent. Bodies formed a shapeless sea. Dust, mixed with blood, hung like a punitive mist. Rome didn't just survive, it won. Not with numerical superiority, but with the rigor of form. Geometry saved the empire. Because in the mathematics of war, sometimes it's the right angle, not brute force, that decides a civilization's future. And on that day, on Britain's soil, the Roman equation was perfect. the battle was over. Overturned wagons, unburied bodies, fires extinguished along the road's edges. Rome, scarred but intact, held control of Britannia. And in that silence, one question lingered unanswered. What happened to Boudica? Sources diverged. Some pointed to suicide, a dignified act in the face of defeat. Others suggested she fell ill, her body never found, her death as nebulous as her rise. Boudica vanished from the earth, but not from history. What endured was the myth, a woman who, in the name of tribal honor, united peoples who had fought each other for centuries, who burned cities, defeated garrisons, and humiliated the world's greatest empire for weeks, and who, though defeated militarily, was never forgotten. Her image crossed generations, not as a tactical commander, but as an embodiment of moral resistance, an icon beyond the battlefield. Yet the myth carries contradictions. The same force that bound her to her people limited her strategic chances. Boudica didn't form a central command. She didn't create a combat doctrine. She led a revolt of emotion, not a campaign of sustainable power. Her march was driven more by vengeance than by a viable plan for power. This doesn't diminish her symbolic strength, but reveals the tragic nature of her figure. Tacitus, in describing her revolt, wavers between respect and criticism. He admires her bravery, but condemns the excesses. He speaks of burned temples, impaled Roman women, brutalities that shocked even the hardest soldiers of the time. Was it part of psychological warfare, the release of pent-up hatred, or the cost of leadership born from trauma, without institutional checks? The line between justice and chaos frays in the heat of vengeance. Boudica'S legacy divides historians. For some, she's a Joan of Arc before the Middle Ages. For others, a rebel without a plan, whose insurrection worsened Roman repression and delayed tribal emancipation. But all agree on one point: her image never faded. Statues, poems, chronicles, and novels resurrect her in every century, because there is something in her that resonates with any subjugated people, any silenced woman, any crushed society that refuses to accept defeat as destiny. Boudica was defeated on the field, but her story defeated time. Her chariot may have stopped, but her voice presses on. Like all tragic figures, she represents a breaking point, when personal suffering becomes a collective cry. And in that cry, there's no strategy, there's truth. And no imperial victory can fully silence it. Because even in defeat, Boudica left a warning. Every civilization that ignores the dignity of its subjects will, sooner or later, hear the roar of those who refuse to kneel. And when it does, neither legions, nor walls, nor past glory will stop history from exacting its price. The military campaign ended, but the scars of the revolt remained etched not just in Britannia's soil, but in the wounded pride of an empire that thought it had everything under control. Rome won, but its victory was costly, bitter, and morally shaky. Boudica'S revolt revealed with brutal clarity a principle neglected by powers through the ages. In asymmetric wars, geography matters less than perception. The map says where you fight. The heart says why you fight. The rebellion wasn't born from military strategy. It was born from humiliation, from public floggings, taxes imposed without dialogue, the dissolution of hard-won alliances. It was the neglect of the human detail, the politics of honor, that inflamed the tribes. Rome built roads, but didn't build trust. It raised cities, but broke bonds. And in doing so, it created an invisible legion of enemies. Britannia's lesson is the same one repeated in modern colonies. Military control may seem absolute, but it's always conditional. An empire can be everywhere and still be foreign. It can dominate physically and lose symbolically. And when that symbolic loss spreads, it becomes war, not of armies, but of emotions. And that's the hardest to win. Roman generals ignored the signs. To them, the Iceni's submission was a done deal, peace a statistic. But beneath the surface, something simmered, a deep, latent resentment forged from centuries of suppressed culture. When it erupted, it showed that no fortress, no road, no legion is enough if the people refuse to be governed. That's what Boudica laid bare. Contemporary studies on insurgent conflicts return to this point. From French Algeria to 21st century Iraq, the pattern repeats. Where local honor is wounded, war flourishes. And usually it's not soldiers who start it, but symbols. Not tanks, but gestures. An insult to culture, a collective punishment, a broken promise. And soon, what seemed like order turns to resistance. Archaeology doesn't just uncover ruins, it uncovers memory. And in Britannia, it reveals not just destruction, but a message. The ash layers over Camulodunum, the impact marks in Londinium, the rubble of Verulamium, they tell a story not just of physical destruction, but of a moral response, of a people who shouted with fire what they couldn't say in Latin. Suetonius Paulinus won, but the cost was high. Rome held Britannia, but at the price of exposing its vulnerabilities. Boudica'S revolt didn't redraw borders, but it exposed invisible boundaries Rome should never have crossed without caution, those of a people's soul. Here's the forgotten lesson. The map is just the skin of war. The true battlefield is the human heart, and no empire can triumph where dignity has been erased. Because where there's humiliation, there will, sooner or later, be resistance, and it will respect neither roots nor treaties nor borders. It will respect only pain. And from that pain, new Boudica'S will rise, with different faces in distant lands, but with the same fury that once set Britannia ablaze. Rome's victory in Britannia didn't end the revolt, it merely changed its form. The physical battlefield was won, but the psychological one still burned. And Suetonius Paulinus, aware of this, didn't seek reconciliation. He chose terror as a tool of pacification. His logic was clear. Only absolute fear would prevent another Boudica from rising. And for that, there was no room for mercy. His orders were direct and brutal. Villages linked to the revolt were razed. Survivors faced exemplary punishment. Executions weren't just military, they were ceremonial. The goal wasn't only to eliminate insurgents, but to reshape the collective imagination of the tribes, to show that defeat meant relentless punishment, that the empire, even wounded, could retaliate with surgical coldness. Paulinus's choice wasn't unique in Roman history. Using fear as a control mechanism was part of imperial doctrine, but in Britannia, it took on extreme contours, because the revolt wasn't just a tactical challenge, it was an affront to Rome's prestige. And Paulinus knew the response had to be as symbolic as it was practical. It needed to leave marks, not just on roads, but in memory. Comparisons with other colonial campaigns reinforced this tactic. During French repression in Algeria or British colonies in Africa, similar measures were used. Public executions, detention camps, village destruction. The intent was always the same: to break the spirit of resistance before it could regroup. And in many cases, this policy had temporary effects, but it bred resentments that would explode decades later. Roman sources vary in their interpretations. Tacitus, in particular, offers a nuanced view. He praises Paulinus's firmness, but warns of the risk that such harshness could create more enemies than allies. Excessive punishment may stop a revolt, but can also sow the seeds of the next. Paulinus chose stability through fear, but he ignored that fear has an expiration date. Archaeological evidence shows signs of this repression. Sites with post-battle destruction, abruptly abandoned villages, mass graves outside tribal burial norms. Proof that after the battle, Rome didn't just reclaim territory, it redrew its control with iron and fire. Britannia was reconquered, but at an invisible cost, the forced silence of those still mourning their dead. Paulinus's leadership was effective, his decision logical within Roman military parameters, but it left scars that never fully healed. Using fear as deterrence wasn't a mistake, it was a deliberate choice, a message. But every message has a response, and an empire that rules by fear walks a razor's edge. Because where there's only silence, there may only be waiting, and every silence, one day, breaks with a sword or with vengeance. The ground was still blackened by the revolt's ashes when the legions began reorganizing Roman control in Britannia. But something had changed. Despite the tactical victory, Rome didn't advance. It retreated in spirit, ambition, and presence. The shock of Boudica'S revolt didn't just reveal the empire's vulnerability in its remotest corner, it redefined its strategy for the region. The consequences weren't just military. Several vulnerable Roman settlements were abandoned or left to fend for themselves. Planned expansion was halted. Fortifications sprang up in previously neglected areas. The architecture of confidence gave way to one of containment. Rome, still Britannia's master, now acted like a cautious visitor, not an absolute ruler. The revolt's costs went beyond the battlefield. Logistics were disrupted, trade routes reassessed. The Roman population, once encouraged to colonize the region, began avoiding the island. Even official reports changed tone. The enthusiasm of early campaigns gave way to language of vigilance and caution. Suetonius Paulinus was replaced soon after the repression, a sign that the Senate preferred a less brutal, more diplomatic approach, not out of altruism, but pragmatism. Archaeological evidence points to a pattern of retraction. Cities flourishing before the revolt show halted expansion. Signs of partial rebuilding, abandoned public works, and deserted administrative complexes. The material evidence reinforces what ancient texts whisper. Rome didn't lose, but it didn't fully win either. It merely survived. Boudica'S revolt became a watershed in imperial policy for peripheral regions. The episode entered the manuals not as an example of enemy heroism, but as a strategic warning. It showed that domination without integration is a short-term victory, that force, when applied without cultural understanding, creates deep cracks, and those cracks, sooner or later, become chasms. Even with Rome's presence in Britannia for over 2 centuries after the revolt, signs of tension never fully vanished. Periodic sparks of unrest flared up, and the memory of the queen who burned 3 cities and united dozens of tribes continued to haunt the imperial legacy. In the end, Rome stayed, but at the cost of curbing its own ambition. Its response was that of an empire that had tasted the bitter sting of vulnerability, and to preserve its presence, it had to retreat in spirit, glory, and drive. Because some victories are mere survival, and the greatest empire of antiquity, facing the fury of an outraged woman, learned that some battles aren't won, they're survived, with visible scars, and others deeper, etched into the strategic memory of an entire civilization. The empire survived. The revolt was crushed, cities rebuilt, and the legions remained in Britannia. But Rome's victory over Boudicca didn't bring stability or restored honor. It brought silence, thick, uneasy, swept under the stones of a ruined forum. Boudica'S revolt, though contained, made it clear that the empire could bleed. that its presence wasn't as solid as its aqueducts, and that behind the facade of order there were cracks formed by arrogance. Karl von Clausewitz would later coin a decisive concept: friction, the gap between planned war and real war. Rome in Britannia fell victim to this friction. It planned domination, it met resistance, it expected submission, it faced tribal pride, and when it tried to restore order with swords, it realized it had lost something unrecoverable by force: legitimacy. Total war, as Clausewitz defined it, isn't confined to the battlefield. It extends to the economy, culture, and soul of a people. And that's where Boudica won. She didn't destroy the empire, but she exposed its illusion of invincibility. She showed that the real battle begins when pride is wounded, when structures crumble from within before walls fall from without. The price of victory was a moral retreat. Rome learned that weapons aren't enough, that roads are useless without trust, that imperial glory is fragile against collective pain. Boudica, even in death, imposed a lesson without return. Never scorn a people's dignity. Never treat honor as a currency of conquest. Because honor, when betrayed, reborn as fury. And fury, when it finds leadership, can set fire to even the sturdiest marble columns. The Iceni queen vanished into history's mist, but her story endures. In every nation that resists, in every silenced voice that finds a way to shout, and in every empire that learns, too late, that subduing is not governing. Boudica'S revolt was an explosion, but its echo crosses centuries, and it teaches, with blood, silence, and ashes, that an empire's greatest strategic error isn't losing a war, it's ignoring why it began. Because where there's humiliation, there's fire, and no empire, however great, is immune to the power of a woman in fury. And you, Commander, faced with a revolt born of disdain, what would you have done? If you've made it to the end of this documentary, give it a thumbs up and comment below which lesson from Boudica'S revolt struck you most. Subscribe and hit the bell to stay updated. And don't go anywhere, our next video is already up, telling an epic story: Hannibal's Trail, Elephants in the Alps against Rome. Click to watch and discover how the great Carthaginian general challenged the mighty Roman Empire. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episode.